To everyone, and today we are going to be talking about how to secure executive engagement. Thank you to everyone who has been on these webinars before, and welcome to those that are joining us for the first time. Those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia, and for those of you who don't currently work with us, Insignia is a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help organisations to plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their corporate lives. And of course, having executive engagement is a real head start as you begin on that process of planning, training, exercising, and sometimes handling. And when you see over the years chief executives like Michael Bishop from British Midland, Richard Branson in the aftermath of the train crash in the Lake District, and Nick Varney subsequent to the Smiler accident, you see the benefits of having a leader or a leadership team who is fully engaged with crisis management and who fully gets the key principles of crisis management. And that's great if that is just intuitive and bred into your leadership team. I know it can be more difficult if crisis management isn't naturally at the top of a leadership team's objectives. What I do know is that having that buy-in makes a huge difference, and it's as well as during a crisis, it's beforehand too. So the chief executive who takes the time to pen and put his or her name to the introduction to the crisis plan is a real statement of intent. And I think perhaps even more powerfully, the leadership team, or indeed the individual at the top of the organization who always attends your exercises and sets an example for the rest of the business to follow, that is also enormously powerful. And I'm guessing that some of you are joining this session today because perhaps in your organizations that doesn't always happen. And for those of you where that is the case, I want to give you a little bit of bad news first of all, and that is there is no magic wand. I guess in the words of the expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But what we do hope to do over the next 45 minutes is to introduce you to 8 ways that we have deployed in the past or seen our clients deploying in the past, which has helped to secure that engagement and helped to secure that backing for crisis management. And I hope that some or all of them may be useful to you in terms of further building the involvement and the focus and the attention of your leadership teams on the important topic of crisis management. What I would also say is this is very much a session whereby if any of you have had successes and deployed strategies or tactics that have really gained traction within your own organizations, please do let us know. If you're happy to share those, post them up on the chat pane within your control panel, and we'll share some of those best practices and successes that you've had in getting engagement. Equally, as usual, please do also post any questions during the course of this webinar, and we will deal with them, or certainly deal with as many of them as possible in the final few minutes at the end of this session. So, no magic wands, but how can we help you to move in the right direction? Well, I guess the first thing to say is if there wasn't a problem, then we wouldn't be bothering having this webinar. What do I mean by a problem? Well, this was a piece of research done by Deloitte in 2016, what it showed was that whilst leaders of organisations felt that they were well prepared and recognised the risks that faced them as organisations, when they dug a bit deeper and investigated how much planning and exercising had actually happened, this was what they found out. So in almost every key area of crisis management planning, training and exercising, a maximum of half of organisations were actually doing what is necessary to be sure that you are ready to respond confidently and effectively should the worst happen. So definitively there is a gap between where crisis managers would want their organisations to be and where those organisations are in reality. I guess it begs the question, why? If leaders recognise that there are risks out there, and if they recognise that they should be prepared, why is it that actually it's not happening in practice? And I guess each of us would have different tales and stories from our own organisations as to the specific reasons for that, but I would summarise it in the following way. I think it's one of those areas, crisis management planning and training, that is hugely important, but it's never urgent until it's really urgent when you're facing the crisis. And at that point, it's too late. So it very much falls in that category of really important, but never urgent. And we all know what happens to those areas. They continually get deprioritized and put to one side. And again, I guess the reasons for that are twofold. One, that leaders judge that the likelihood of something happening is low enough for them not to prioritize crisis management planning and training, and or that the impact would be something that they could cope with if it did happen. I would suggest that that is flawed thinking, and that the evidence shows that is flawed thinking, and hopefully some of what we'll talk about over the next half an hour or so will give you the evidence and the ammunition to combat some of those beliefs. So, 8 strategies, 8 lines of thinking to help you overcome those barriers. The first one is simply to demonstrate the cost of failure. Even if we accept that it's not certain that a crisis will affect your organization, albeit over a 5 or 10 year period, I think it's pretty likely that a crisis will affect your organization. When and if it does happen, the impact, the cost can be huge. In the worst possible case, we have seen organizations going out of business. In other cases, and we'll take a look in a minute, we absolutely see a fall in the value of those organizations. And given that leadership teams are responsible for building and protecting value within organizations, prudent, responsible crisis management planning and training should be part of their responsibilities and should be a key focus if they are to live up to their responsibilities of protecting and growing those organizations. So what are some of the examples of the cost of failure? Well, if we look at BP and Deepwater Horizon, 1 year after the spill, their stock was in absolute terms 30% below where it was before the spill. If you look at it today, it is still significantly below its competitors in comparative terms. So that's one very powerful example of the financial cost of a crisis. Bringing us more up to date, 4 months after the emissions scandal broke, VW shares were down 34%. Move to another industry and another type of crisis, Equifax, after their data breach, 14% down 6 months after that breach. So there are many, many examples of reduction in shareholder value as a result of a crisis, and in particular as a result of a mishandled crisis, which of course brings me onto the slide which I show in almost all of these presentations, which is the one from Oxford Metrica, which shows that how you respond to a crisis has a significant effect on where you end up a year later. The blue line being those that handle crises well, arrest the slide in the fall of the organization, and then actually overperform expectations based on a metaphorical pat on the back to the management team for having proven themselves under intense pressure. Unfortunately, many others end up on the red track here, losing significant amounts of value in the year after the crisis. And again, what this research shows, and it is well worth reading and maybe sharing with your leadership team, it shows that what happens in those first 2 or 3 days after the crisis breaks is really a critical determinant of where you end up. How can you ensure that you do and say the right things in those first 3 days? Only through crisis planning, training and exercising before the event. The pressure is so intense and the resource requirements are so great that trying to manage a situation without doing that preparation and planning is nigh on impossible. So that's the financial impact in terms of the value of an organization, which I think is a very powerful argument for leadership teams. But not all organizations are quoted, and so the actual value of the organization is sometimes hidden. There are other costs to be taken into account, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. One of the kind of hidden costs, but a real big one in the medium and long term, is your ability to retain and recruit staff, your employer brand, if you like. If you become embroiled in a big crisis and come out of it badly, you will find that people start to leave the organization, and you will find it harder to recruit high quality new people. So there are ripple effects beyond the pure value of the organization. Of course, there are other costs like fines, like the costs of putting things right, whether that's a product recall or a technical fix or additional spend on specialist IT consultants to sort out the systems that allowed the data breach to occur. So there are other kind of third-party costs. But I would say possibly the biggest cost of all, and the one that maybe you could draw to your leadership team's attention, is actually management time and focus. Very recent crisis that we had here in the UK over the last couple of weeks is the TSB service outage, which meant that many people were unable to access their bank accounts for long periods of time. One of the things that Chief Executive Paul Pester said on the second day of the crisis was, "I will take direct control from 8 o'clock this morning for our platform. I've drafted in a team of global experts from IBM. They are reporting directly to me, and I will take control of the platform until it gets fixed. I am putting things right." Now, we'll touch on the TSB situation briefly later in the presentation, but that quote indicates quite accurately the level of involvement that the leadership team will have to have if they are to exert influence over a crisis situation. That is very, very, very valuable time, and for a period of days weeks, and sometimes months, a disproportionate amount of management time will be focused on responding to a crisis. Getting the planning right beforehand and therefore responding effectively and efficiently to a crisis will reduce that diversion of very expensive, very high-powered management time significantly. So yes, value, yes, third-party costs, but don't underestimate the value of time. And that, I think, is a message which you would do well to communicate to your senior leaders. The second area for consideration, make it personal. We've talked about business value and we've talked about potential fines, but we are all individuals. We all care about our own personal reputations. And when a crisis occurs, the reputation and the credibility of the individuals leading that organization are very much on the line. And getting your senior colleagues to recognize that, understand that, can be very motivating in terms of making sure that they do plan and prepare to do and say the right thing. For those of you who are younger than me and don't remember this crisis from 1991, the gentleman in the picture is Gerald Ratner, who set up a very, very successful chain of jewelry stores. It was the market leader in 1991, well known for their competitive prices. And those of you who are a similar age to me will remember when all of that changed, when he spoke to an IOD conference and said to the assembled audience, including the media, people say, "How can you sell this for such a low price?" I say, "Because it's total crap." Now, that single comment not only wiped £500 million off the value of the business, it also completely destroyed his own personal reputation. He lost his job as the chief executive of the business that he founded and grew from nothing into the successful business it was. So, a serious crisis can have a big personal impact on an individual's reputation, and that can be very motivating. We've seen it in the last few years with Tony Hayward from BP, who had a really tough time and whose reputation really suffered as a result of the way that BP handled its response to the Gulf oil spill. And most recently, and again, I've mentioned this gentleman earlier in this discussion, Paul Pester is under significant pressure as well, the chief executive of TSB. So I guess chief executives need to recognize that situations that become major crises and situations where crises are mishandled will not only affect the organization's reputation and good name, they can also have a very big impact on their own good name. And clearly, that can be a very powerful motivating factor. Again, I'd like to slightly broaden this area out, though, as well. When you start to think about influencing your leaders to perhaps invest more time, effort, and money into crisis management planning and training, think about what motivates them as individuals. Some of your leaders will be particularly focused on customer service. So play up the benefits in terms of customer service and customer relationships of doing crisis management well. Some of them might be focused on reliability. In other words, the quality of the product. Again, play up that message, the benefits of crisis management in that area. For others, it may be all about people. And clearly, communicating and caring for people is one of the key benefits that can come out of good crisis planning. So think about your leadership team as individuals, what matters to them, what will motivate them when you talk to them about why they should be focusing even more on crisis management planning and training. Now, I think one of the reasons why sometimes it's hard to get leaders to focus on crisis management planning and training is because it costs. It costs in terms of investment, in terms of money. It also costs in terms of time. And when this is perceived as perhaps an insurance policy, so you're spending time and money on something you hope never to have to use, that can make it quite a hard decision when you are evaluating that investment in crisis management on other areas that you could spend the money on in the business. The point here, though, is that thinking is actually based on a flawed belief. The belief that crisis management planning and training only has a benefit should the worst happen is wrong. And in fact, engaging in crisis management planning, training, and exercising can have huge benefits in terms of business as usual. The first one, I guess, that I should communicate, the first benefit, though, is really by doing the planning and the training, you become less likely to suffer a crisis in the first place. That's because the organization will be more vigilant. It's because the organization will address some of the flaws that were identified within the planning process. And so simply by engaging in crisis management planning and training, you will reduce the chance of the crisis happening in the first place. But there are even broader benefits, and here are some of them. By engaging particularly in crisis management training and exercises, these are some of the skills that can be built up: leadership, decision-making, analysis, communication, teamwork, project management, listening skills, prioritization, and scenario planning. These are all skills, and there are others, which are incredibly valuable in a business as usual situation. But because they are trained and rehearsed in a pressurized environment, for example, during a simulation, those learnings and those skills are really quite deeply embedded and therefore can be very effectively deployed in a business as usual situation. Let me give you an example of that. One of the techniques that I know a number of you who are our clients will be using, that we share with our clients, is the 4 boards system. It's a means of organization, prioritization, and action planning that we deploy with many of our clients in terms of the way of responding to a crisis. That 4 board system is designed for use in a crisis, but I was fascinated to be talking with a client on Friday who was talking to me about how they have used exactly that process but for more day-to-day activities. And what they said was it's just given them a really focused and effective way of getting from, a broad-ranging discussion into a very clear and prioritized action plan. It's a crisis management tool, but it's been applied to a business as usual setting. Another critical one from this list that you see here is decision making. Decision making in a crisis is clearly particularly difficult because you're under pressure, the stakes are high, information is scarce, and the training and the learning and the skills developed in decision making through crisis management exercises, that can be transferred and translated into a business as usual setting. So doing a full crisis management program isn't just about building skills to be used only if the worst should happen. It actually has much broader benefits too. Timing. When thinking about how to engage your peers or leaders in crisis management, as with everything in life, timing can make the difference between a yes or a no. So let's have a think about how, in our experience, different types of timing can make a difference to your success in getting a project off the ground. A really critical one in my experience is what is going on in the outside world. So as crisis managers yourselves, wanting to get the attention of your leaders, being very vigilant to the outside world and what is happening out there that might cause your leaders to be more engaged, I think that's an important part of your role. So, for example, when PwC published their latest global CEO survey, you will see on the right-hand side of this slide that terrorism and cyber threats are kind of rocketing up the charts in terms of what CEOs are concerned about. Therefore, conversations with them right now about what we can do to plan for a terrorism incident or what we can do to plan and train for potential cyber threats is much more likely to land now than it even was 12 months ago. So take time, talk to people, look at research, just look around you and work out what is it out there that may be causing concern, pain, or pressure on us as an organization and our leaders in particular, and therefore what might be some of the hot buttons that get someone to go, do you know what, now is the right time for us to really kick off a crisis management planning and training program. So that's one trigger in terms of timing. External, broader kind of socio-economic issues. Closer to home, though, competitor issues can be a really effective wake-up call. You will all have things going on within your own industry or sector, and in my experience, when something really quite bad happens to a competitor, it can be a real wake-up call to our organization to say, do you know what, that's just happened to competitor X, there but for the grace of God, go us. So a crisis or an incident or an issue near to home can often be the catalyst for getting ourselves up to speed and making sure that should the same thing happen to us, we would be ready to respond. Good example from one particular sector, the food sector, was the horse meat scandal. Even those food producers that were unaffected by horse meat, many of them invested significantly in crisis management planning, training, and exercising as a result of recognizing we don't quite know our supply chain. What if this kind of crisis was to affect us? How would we respond? Not sure. Better do some work. So if there is an issue emerging within your sector or hitting a particular competitor, that also can be a very good time to have a fruitful conversation with your leadership team. And three other areas in terms of timing. Corporate change. Change, by definition, provides opportunities. And whether we're talking about acquisition, whether we're talking about a change of leadership team, when change happens, there is an opportunity for you to have a fresh conversation with your leaders about, does this change mean that crisis management planning and training is now particularly relevant? I would emphasize, be aware as new people join the organization, they may come with influence, or, a leadership team maybe that didn't have crisis management team as a high priority with a couple of senior hires may suddenly have a very different perspective. So be vigilant for change that may be a precursor to action. Near misses. A near miss within your own organization, so becoming really close to home, an accident that was prevented by the skin of our teeth. A minor issue which could have exploded but didn't. These kinds of warnings can be the catalyst to get a program of planning and training underway. So don't let near misses go to waste. Let them be the warning sign that caused the organisation to take the issue seriously. And budget cycles, I'm sure I am preaching to the converted here, but know when the right time to ask is in terms of budget availability. On a couple of occasions in the past, we have been the beneficiaries of organisations that had budget spare towards the end of the year, had always had crisis management in that important but not urgent category, and took the opportunity to spend that budget on doing some crisis management planning and training on the basis that if we don't spend this money in this financial year, then we may not have that next year. So do be aware of the budget cycle. As I say, this thing about crisis management planning being recognised as as important, but not necessarily urgent, actually mopping up some budget towards the end of the financial year can be one of those occasions when important but not urgent areas of the business get the attention that they really deserve. So timing, try and get your timing right. I know that in many organisations, those of us that are passionate about crisis management planning, training and exercising can sometimes feel like we are a sole voice. And I think one of the things to try and address that is to build alliances with like-minded colleagues. You know, if you work in business continuity, identify and build alliances with your communication colleagues. If you work within the legal area, build alliances with people in your HR team. And in fact, build a grand alliance with all of the people within the organization who have an interest and a stake in crisis management, whether that be from a legal, HR, communication, risk, security, business continuity perspective. All of these people will share a desire and an interest in making sure that the organization is geared up to respond well. So if you're not succeeding in getting cut through as a lone voice, work out who you can collaborate with, who you can build relationships with to present a united front, because undoubtedly 2 voices or 6 voices saying the same things and communicating the benefits of crisis management planning ahead of the event, but from different perspectives, that can be really, really powerful. Moving on, from small acorns, great oak trees grow. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I recognise that going from perhaps a very skeletal, perhaps a non-existent program of crisis management planning and training to a fully comprehensive, holistic, overarching, robust, state-of-the-art crisis management infrastructure is a big leap. And getting your senior leadership team to commit from perhaps doing almost nothing to everything, again, perhaps is overambitious. And so what I would suggest is, if that is the case, maybe start small and grow your crisis management program. And in order to do that, I would recommend starting with something that fulfills 2 criteria. One, it generates real value or benefits in its own right. So simply by doing it, you will enhance your crisis resilience. But secondly, one that also actively engages those leaders that you want to be involved in your program going forward. 2 examples of that I would suggest are a reputational risk assessment, getting together leaders and representatives from around the business to map out where could we be vulnerable, what could happen to us that could damage this fantastic reputation that we've built up. And or secondly, often as a follow-on, but could be separate from the risk assessment, scenario planning, actually walking through some of our key risks and identifying and discussing with those leaders again, how would we respond to this situation? Do we have the resources? Do we have the people available? Where are the gaps? How would we do that? Would we do that? Both of those sessions, the reputational risk assessment and the scenario planning session, are examples whereby simply going through the exercise, you will derive value and benefit, but you will also almost inevitably get the engagement, interest, and appropriate level of concern from your leaders that can then kickstart a bigger or an ongoing program of planning and training to follow. So if you can't get traction for the all singing, all dancing crisis management program, maybe start small and work from that point forward. Deploy trusted third parties. I talked earlier about building alliances with your colleagues in legal, communications, business continuity, risk, and security. This is slightly different. Again, if you are having difficulty securing that traction, that buy-in from your senior leaders, think about deploying trusted third parties to communicate your messages for you. Let me give you a couple of examples of who those might be. Non-executive directors can be really powerful in getting the leadership team to focus on crisis management. By their very nature, many non-execs will have kind of been there, seen that, done that. They will have probably lived through crises of their own. So getting their ear and having them recommending or advising or suggesting to the leadership team that they should be focused on this area, that can be a very effective route through. Equally, there will be those informal influencers that you know have the ear of the CEO or other key players within the leadership team. Who can you bring into your confidence? Who can you align with? Who you know, even if they may not have the right job title, they have the ability to influence those senior leaders. So getting aligned with them and sending them off in the right direction can be really effective. At this point, we're probably into the last 5 minutes or so of the presentation. So if you do have any questions, please do put those via the question pane, and we'll try and deal with as many of those as possible. So, final suggested strategy for securing engagement. Start closer to home. So most of this presentation has been about securing the engagement and the support and ideally the active leadership of your top team. If you find that is just almost impossible to achieve, my advice would be don't just give up, but actually, I guess, get your own departmental house in order. So if you are responsible for communications, there's nothing to stop you developing your crisis communications plan, the template materials, the processes, the principles, the activation of your team, so that even if there isn't an overarching organizational commitment or crisis management framework, should the worst happen, you will be ready to go. The other benefit of that is if you do have a near miss rather than a fully fledged crisis, then actually your peers will probably be exposed to the work that you've done and maybe recognize that they should be engaging with a similar process themselves. So if all else fails, get your own house in order, I guess, would be the message. So in summary, having a leadership team which is fully engaged, supportive, and actively championing crisis management makes a huge difference, both in terms of the planning, the training, the exercising phase, when that visible leadership will make sure that everybody else is engaged, and of course, critically in the event of a real crisis. And in the words of Richard Branson, the test of a company's leadership and of a CEO in particular usually comes during a crisis. So having them on board is incredibly valuable, makes a real difference. I hope that some of the strategies that we've talked about over the last 40 minutes or so can help to get some of your leaders even more on board. Right, we do have some questions, and I'm taking them as they arrive, and I'll do my best to answer them. So, how can this be put across in a public sector context when share value is not a motivator? So, yes, absolutely. Not all organisations have a share price to defend, and that's true with a number of organisations in the private sector as well as the public sector. I guess in those cases it is about maintaining trust and license to operate. You know, over the years there are many public sector organisations that have seriously fallen foul of badly handled crises, and the impact on them has been huge. One only needs to look back at the Grenfell Tower disaster last year to realise the impact that can have on the public sector as well as private sector organisations. We know that in the Grenfell Tower example, the chief executive of the council had to resign, and a number of other public sector organisations very much came under the spotlight as well. So whilst there isn't a value to protect, there is absolutely a reputation to protect, trusting relationships to protect, and I think there are many examples of the downside and the negative impact of organisations in the public sector not being ready to respond. And again, I think Grenfell Tower itself actually was quite a motivator for a number of councils to think, do you know what, that could have been us. What do we need to do to plan and prepare differently? So perhaps that might be one of the best answers to that scenario. Rather than looking to share price, look at some recent cases and how they might relate to you as an organisation, how they might act as motivators. The next question, how often would you expect a senior team to take part in an exercise? So I think to an extent it depends on the organisation. If you're in a high risk organisation, you know, one that actually may very well have a major incident or crisis occur, I'd be looking at the leadership team twice a year minimum undertaking an exercise. If you're not in a high risk sector, I would say at least annually. Less than that, and the learnings are not really being ingrained. So yeah, leadership team on an annual basis as a minimum. Do you have an average figure to help show the fall in value of business after it has suffered a crisis? Ballpark exclamation mark. I can, subsequent to this session, I can share some specifics, Jocelyn, who asked that question regarding those share price falls. Again, I think I would draw attention particularly to the Oxford Metrica research, which did actually look at a whole range of crisis situations, and which therefore does have those kinds of averages available. Typically, and this is typically on day one, the fall will be around 10%. It can be more, it can be less, but around 10%. The really interesting thing, as I say, is what happens after day one, because the outside world on day one is going to downrate you because it's a time of uncertainty and markets don't like uncertainty. What's really interesting is what happens on days 2 and 3 when they start to evaluate the quality of the organization's response. So I think that covers the questions. If you do have any further questions, then please put them kind of right now. Otherwise, a couple of follow-ups. So the recording of this webinar, if you'd like to share it with colleagues, will be available within 24 hours, and we will mail a link out to you. Equally, we have also produced a report outlining the 8 strategies in more detail. That will also be available in the next 24 hours. It'll be on the resources section of our website, but again, we'll send you a link in our follow-up email. I also wanted to give you an early heads up about our next live exercise rather than virtual session as this one is. A number of you I know on the line have joined us at one or both of our recent exercises at the Cabinet War Rooms. We have another session coming up in 4 months' time on the 11th of September, perhaps slightly unfortunate choice of date, but we have our next exercise coming up in September. We will be sending out invitations just before the summer holiday season, but please do put that in your diaries if you would be interested in attending that half-day session. So I'm just checking if there are any final questions, and I can't see any more. So I would just say thank you for joining this webinar. I recognize that securing leadership, attention, focus, engagement, and as I say, ideally active championing of crisis management can be difficult, but I promise you the benefits of doing it are absolutely enormous. So I wish you very well in your efforts in doing that. If you have any questions in follow-up to this session that you'd like to pick up offline, all of my contact details are there. Do please feel free to contact me. Thank you for joining us, and I very much look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar in a couple of months' time. Thank you.